Miss Marple and the Halloween cooking competition poisoning. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like the petals of a midnight rose. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight we find ourselves in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where autumn leaves whisper secrets and jack-o'-lanterns grin with knowing malice. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what brings you to our channel. Perhaps you're a devoted Christie enthusiast, or maybe you've stumbled upon us while searching for the perfect mystery to accompany your evening tea. Whatever brought you here, settle in comfortably. Draw the curtains against the October darkness, and let us step into the observant world of Miss Jane Marple, who this Halloween evening will witness something far more sinister than costume ghosts and plastic spiders. Chapter 1. The spooky bake-off begins in earnest. The village hall of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into a delightfully macabre wonderland of orange and black bunting, with paper bats suspended from the rafters and cardboard tombstones arranged along the windowsills. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent considerable effort ensuring that everything was properly organised. The annual Halloween bake-off had become quite the event in recent years, drawing competitors from neighbouring villages and even attracting the attention of minor celebrities in the culinary world. This year's celebrity judge was none other than Vanessa Blackwood, the notoriously sharp-tongued food critic whose television programme had made her a household name throughout England. Miss Marple had watched the woman arrive an hour earlier, sweeping into the hall with the imperious bearing of someone accustomed to being the centre of attention. Vanessa was a striking woman in her mid-40s, with auburn hair styled in an elaborate updo and a designer dress that seemed rather too sophisticated for a village baking competition. Her makeup was flawless, her jewellery expensive, and her manner suggested she considered this assignment somewhat beneath her usual standards. The competition itself was scheduled to run from 5 until 8 in the evening, with 12 amateur bakers creating Halloween-themed confections while their children trick-or-treated through the judging area, collecting samples from each contestant's display. It was an innovative arrangement that Mrs. Bantry had proposed, combining family entertainment with the competitive element. The children, dressed in various costumes ranging from traditional ghosts to elaborate superhero ensembles, added considerably to the festive atmosphere as they wandered between the baking stations with their treat bags. Miss Marple's role was to help organise the children's trick-or-treating route, ensuring they visited each display in an orderly fashion and didn't overwhelm any single contestant. It was a position that allowed her to observe the entire hall from various vantages, noting the interactions between contestants, judges and spectators with the keen attention that had served her so well in previous investigations. Not that she expected any investigations this evening, of course. This was meant to be a pleasant community gathering, nothing more. The contestants themselves represented a diverse cross-section of the local population. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had entered what appeared to be an elaborate witch's cauldron cake, complete with dry ice creating an atmospheric fog effect. Young Timothy Fletcher was constructing a cemetery scene from chocolate brownies and sugar cookies. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, a recently retired nurse who Miss Marple knew slightly from church functions, was working on an intricate haunted house made entirely from gingerbread and royal icing. Mrs. Finch was a small, neat woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the efficient movements of someone accustomed to precision work. She wore a witch costume for the occasion, complete with a pointed hat that bobbed as she worked. Miss Marple noticed that she seemed particularly focused on her creation, consulting notes and measuring ingredients with almost medical precision. The haunted house was indeed impressive, with tiny gingerbread figures positioned in the windows and elaborate piping work, creating the illusion of weathered boards. The atmosphere in the hall was cheerful and competitive, with contestants exchanging friendly banter while secretly eyeing each other's creations. The air was thick with the mingled scents of baking sugar, chocolate and spices. Halloween music played softly from speakers in the corners, and the children's excited voices created a pleasant background noise that spoke of innocent enjoyment. Vanessa Blackwood circulated through the hall during the early stages of the competition, making notes on an expensive leather-bound notebook and occasionally pausing to watch a particular technique. Miss Marple observed that several contestants seemed nervous in her presence, while others appeared to regard her with something approaching hostility. The food critic had a reputation for harsh reviews, and Miss Marple recalled reading several articles about careers that had been damaged or destroyed by Vanessa's cutting commentary. At precisely 6:30, Vanessa began her official tasting round, starting with the first contestants' display at the entrance to the hall. Each baker had prepared sample portions of their creation, arranged attractively on Halloween-themed serving plates. The children had been instructed to wait until after the judging before collecting their treats, creating an atmosphere of anticipation as families gathered to watch Vanessa's reactions. Miss Marple positioned herself near the refreshment table, where she could observe the entire judging process while appearing to simply enjoy a cup of tea. Her keen eyes noted Vanessa's theatrical approach to tasting, making exaggerated expressions of pleasure or distaste that seemed calculated to entertain the small crowd of spectators. Some contestants received grudging nods of approval, while others faced withering comments about technique or presentation. The atmosphere in the hall grew gradually more tense as the evening progressed. By 7:30, Vanessa had tasted samples from 11 of the 12 contestants, saving Mrs. Finch's haunted house for last. Miss Marple noticed that the food critic appeared slightly flushed and was occasionally pressing her hand to her chest, though she continued with her judging duties without complaint. The children had been released to begin their treat collecting at 7:15, and their excited voices filled the hall as they admired the various creations. Miss Marple found herself drawn to Mrs. Finch's display, where the haunted house stood in all its Gothic glory. The gingerbread structure was remarkable in its detail, with tiny windows filled with what appeared to be stained glass made from melted hard candies. The black icing used for decorative effect created a suitably spooky appearance, and small fondant ghosts seemed to float around the structure's perimeter. Mrs. Finch stood beside her creation with an expression that Miss Marple found difficult to interpret, somewhere between pride and something darker. Chapter 2. A critic's final judgment proves fatal. At 7:45, Vanessa Blackwood approached the final display with her characteristic theatrical flourish. Mrs. Finch stood beside her haunted house with what appeared to be calm anticipation, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her hands as she offered the sample plate to the food critic. The gingerbread had been cut into neat squares, each piece showcasing the intricate piping work and the distinctive black colouring that gave the house its appropriately spooky appearance. Vanessa lifted one square to examine it more closely, holding it up to the light as though inspecting a precious gem. She made several comments about the craftsmanship, her tone suggesting grudging respect for the technical skill involved. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Finch's expression remained carefully neutral, though her fingers worried at the hem of her witch costume in a gesture that betrayed underlying tension. The food critic took a deliberate bite of the gingerbread, chewing thoughtfully while the assembled crowd waited for her verdict. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Vanessa made notes in her leather book, nodding slightly as she prepared to deliver her final judgment. Then, quite suddenly, her expression changed. Her hand went to her throat, and Miss Marple saw her face begin to flush an alarming shade of red. What happened next occurred with terrifying swiftness. Vanessa's breathing became laboured, producing a harsh, wheezing sound that cut through the cheerful Halloween music. Her face began to swell, particularly around the lips and eyes, and she clutched at the display table for support. Several spectators rushed forward, but Vanessa was already collapsing, her knees buckling as she struggled to draw breath. Dr. Haydock, who had been enjoying the competition from the sidelines, immediately pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the fallen woman. His experienced hands checked her pulse while his eyes assessed the swelling with professional concern. He called sharply for someone to ring for an ambulance, then turned to Vanessa's handbag, which had fallen to the floor beside her. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Haydock rifled through the expensive leather bag, clearly searching for something specific. He produced an EpiPen, the emergency medication designed to counteract severe allergic reactions, and immediately administered it to Vanessa's thigh through her designer dress. But even as he deployed the device, Miss Marple could see from his expression that something was wrong. The expected response did not occur. Vanessa's breathing did not ease, and the swelling continued to worsen. Dr. Haydock attempted CPR, his movements efficient despite the awkward position on the village hall floor. Several minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the doctor's counting and the horrified whispers of the crowd. The children had been ushered to the far end of the hall, though their frightened faces peered around adult legs at the unfolding tragedy. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, but Miss Marple could see that it was already too late. The paramedics worked with professional determination, but Dr. Haydock's grim expression told the story before any words were spoken. Vanessa Blackwood, the celebrated and feared food critic, was dead at 43, apparently from anaphylactic shock despite the administration of emergency medication. As the paramedics worked, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Haydock examining the EpiPen with a puzzled frown. He held it up to the light, studying it with the careful attention of a man who has encountered something unexpected. After a moment, he caught Miss Marple's eye and gestured for her to join him in a quiet corner, while the emergency personnel continued their procedures. The EpiPen was empty, as one would expect after use, but Dr. Haydock's concern focused on something else entirely. He explained in low tones that the device should have contained epinephrine, the powerful medication designed to halt allergic reactions. However, the liquid that had been injected appeared suspiciously clear and watery, quite unlike the slightly yellowish appearance that epinephrine typically exhibited. His professional instinct suggested that the medication had been tampered with, possibly replaced with something ineffective like saline solution. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm that comes from decades of encountering human wickedness in its various forms. If Dr. Haydock's suspicions proved correct, then Vanessa's death was not a tragic accident, but a carefully planned murder. Someone had not only introduced an allergen into the food critic's system, but had also sabotaged her emergency medication to ensure the allergic reaction would prove fatal. The implications were chilling. This level of premeditation suggested detailed planning and specific knowledge about Vanessa's medical situation. It also indicated someone with the means and opportunity to access her personal belongings, specifically her handbag, where the EpiPen was stored. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had already noted that Vanessa's bag had been left unattended on a chair during the early part of the evening, when the food critic had been circulating through the hall making preliminary observations. As the police were summoned and the hall gradually emptied of spectators, Miss Marple found herself studying the 12 baking displays with renewed interest. Somewhere among these seemingly innocent Halloween confections was the source of the allergen that had triggered Vanessa's fatal reaction. The question was which one, and more importantly, how had the killer ensured that the allergen would only affect Vanessa at the precise moment of tasting the final entry? Chapter 3. Medical mysteries and hidden allergies emerge. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his perpetually irritated expression suggesting he regarded this Halloween evening murder as a personal affront to his schedule. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on several previous occasions, and while she found his manner somewhat brusque, she respected his fundamental competence in criminal investigation. He established a perimeter around Mrs. Finch's display and began the methodical process of questioning witnesses. Dr. Haydock provided his preliminary assessment, carefully explaining his concerns about the tampered EpiPen. The device had been sent for laboratory analysis, but his professional opinion was unequivocal. The medication cartridge had been emptied and refilled with what appeared to be saline solution, rendering it useless for treating anaphylactic shock. This sabotage, combined with exposure to an unknown allergen, had created a perfect storm of circumstances that resulted in Vanessa's death. Miss Marple listened intently as Dr. Haydock described the typical progression of anaphylaxis. The reaction usually began within minutes of exposure to the triggering substance, though the severity and speed could vary considerably. What puzzled both the doctor and the detective was why Vanessa had tasted samples from 11 different contestants without incident before suffering her fatal reaction to the 12th. Inspector Slack's questioning revealed that Vanessa had no documented food allergies. Her agent, reached by telephone, confirmed that she regularly ate at restaurants representing all manner of cuisines and had never reported any adverse reactions. This absence of known allergies made her sudden anaphylactic shock all the more mysterious. People did not typically develop severe allergic reactions to common baking ingredients without prior warning. Miss Marple suggested gently that perhaps they should examine Vanessa's recent medical history more thoroughly. Sometimes allergies develop later in life, particularly to substances that had never caused problems before. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully and mentioned that he would contact Vanessa's personal physician in London, though patient confidentiality might limit the information they could obtain without a warrant. the inspector proceeded to interview each contestant individually, asking about their ingredients and whether they had any personal grievances against the deceased food critic. The responses proved illuminating in their variety. Several bakers admitted to harbouring resentment toward Vanessa, though most insisted their feelings had not extended to contemplating murder. Mrs. Bantry, when questioned, revealed that Vanessa had given her restaurant a scathing review 5 years earlier, effectively destroying her brief attempt at commercial catering. Young Timothy Fletcher's mother mentioned that Vanessa had been particularly cruel to a cousin who had appeared on her television programme. Even the vicar's wife admitted to having been publicly humiliated during a charity baking demonstration that Vanessa had judged. However, it was the information about Mrs. Eleanor Finch that proved most interesting. Under gentle questioning from Inspector Slack, several villagers revealed that Mrs. Finch's daughter Catherine had been a promising young chef, whose career had been destroyed by one of Vanessa's televised reviews. The review had been particularly brutal, attacking not just the food but Catherine's personality and appearance. The young woman had subsequently suffered from severe depression and had taken her own life 2 years ago. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Finch's reaction to this line of questioning with careful attention. The retired nurse maintained her composure admirably, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped the edge of the table. She acknowledged her daughter's suicide with quiet dignity, stating that while she blamed Vanessa for contributing to Catherine's depression, she had never contemplated revenge through murder. Dr. Haydock mentioned that Mrs. Finch had worked at his practice until her retirement last year, and had occasionally volunteered to help with filing and administrative tasks even after leaving. This information seemed to capture Inspector Slack's interest, as it suggested Mrs. Finch might have had access to confidential medical records, including any recent diagnoses that patients might have kept private. As the interviews progressed into the late evening, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the ingredient lists that all contestants had been required to submit before the competition. Inspector Slack, recognizing her previous contributions to criminal investigations, readily agreed. The lists were standard forms provided by Mrs. Bantry, requiring detailed enumeration of all components used in each creation. Miss Marple spread the 12 lists across a table and began her careful examination. Most contained predictable ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, various flavourings, and food colourings. However, 3 contestants had used black food colouring to achieve the appropriately spooky appearance expected of Halloween baking. This detail caught her attention immediately. She noted that the 3 contestants using black colouring had chosen different brands. Mrs. Bantry had used Wilton black gel colouring, Timothy Fletcher had used Dr. Oetker natural black food dye, and Mrs. Finch had used a brand called Sugarflare Spectral Black that Miss Marple had never encountered before. Each brand achieved the desired dark colour through different chemical compositions. When Miss Marple mentioned this observation to Dr. Haydock, he immediately grasped its significance. Some food colourings, particularly specialty products, contained unusual ingredients that might trigger allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. He suggested they research each brand to determine its precise chemical composition, particularly focusing on any components derived from natural sources, rather than synthetic dyes. Chapter 4. The cochineal connection reveals itself clearly. The following morning brought grey skies and persistent drizzle that seemed appropriate to the sombre mood pervading St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had spent a restless night considering the various puzzles presented by Vanessa Blackwood's murder. The 2-stage nature of the crime, requiring both the introduction of an allergen and the sabotage of emergency medication, suggested a level of planning that went far beyond a momentary impulse of revenge. She received a telephone call from Dr. Haydock just after breakfast. The doctor's voice carried an undercurrent of excitement as he shared his research findings regarding the food colourings used in the competition. He had spent several hours consulting pharmaceutical references and contacting manufacturers to determine the precise composition of each brand mentioned on the ingredient lists. The Wilton and Dr. Oetker colourings, he explained, were synthetic products composed of chemical dyes approved for food use. However, the Sugarflare Spectral Black that Mrs. Finch had used contained a natural component called carmine, also known as cochineal extract. This substance was derived from crushed cochineal insects and was commonly used to produce red and black colourings in various food products. What made this discovery particularly significant was carmine's well-documented potential to cause severe allergic reactions in certain individuals, particularly those with shellfish allergies. The protein structures in cochineal insects bore sufficient similarity to shellfish proteins that cross-reactions were not uncommon. A person with a shellfish allergy might react severely to carmine without ever realizing the connection. Miss Marple thanked Dr. Haydock for this information and immediately requested that Inspector Slack contact Vanessa's personal physician in London regarding any recent allergy diagnoses. She had a growing suspicion that the food critic might have developed a shellfish sensitivity that had not been made public, perhaps for professional reasons relating to her restaurant reviewing duties. The inspector proved remarkably cooperative when Miss Marple shared her theory. He obtained the necessary warrant and made contact with Dr. Sebastian Wright, Vanessa's physician in Harley Street. After some initial reluctance regarding patient confidentiality, Dr. Wright confirmed that Vanessa had indeed been diagnosed with a mild shellfish allergy approximately 3 months earlier, following a reaction to prawns at a seafood restaurant. The diagnosis had been kept strictly confidential at Vanessa's insistence. She had feared that publicizing the allergy would damage her reputation as a fearless food critic willing to try anything. Dr. Wright had prescribed an EpiPen for emergency use and had advised Vanessa to avoid shellfish, though he noted that the initial reaction had been relatively mild, and she had expressed confidence in managing the condition discreetly. This revelation transformed the investigation entirely. The killer had not simply introduced a random allergen hoping for a reaction. They had specifically chosen carmine, knowing that Vanessa had a shellfish allergy that would make her vulnerable to this particular substance. This level of targeted planning indicated someone with access to Vanessa's private medical information that had been carefully guarded from public knowledge. Miss Marple considered the implications while taking her customary morning walk through the village. The autumn rain had given way to watery sunshine, and the wet pavements gleamed in the pale light. Mrs. Finch's cottage lay at the far end of the village, a neat structure with a well-maintained garden and lace curtains in the windows. Miss Marple had visited it once before, delivering a church newsletter, and recalled the impeccable order that characterized every aspect of Mrs. Finch's domestic arrangements. The retired nurse's background in medicine suddenly took on sinister significance. Mrs. Finch had worked at Dr. Haydock's practice, which meant she would understand patient confidentiality protocols and how to access medical files discreetly. Her occasional volunteer work, continuing even after retirement, would have provided opportunities to browse through records without arousing suspicion. But how would Mrs. Finch have learned about Vanessa's shellfish allergy specifically? Dr. Haydock's practice was in St. Mary Mead, while Vanessa's physician was in London. There seemed to be no obvious connection between the two medical practices. Unless, Miss Marple reflected, Dr. Haydock had been consulted about the allergy during one of Vanessa's visits to the area. A conversation with Dr. Haydock confirmed this suspicion. The physician recalled that Vanessa had experienced a minor reaction during a restaurant meal in the neighbouring town of Much Benham about 2 months ago. She had visited his surgery seeking advice, and he had consulted with Dr. Wright before confirming the shellfish allergy diagnosis. The consultation notes would have been filed in Dr. Haydock's records, accessible to anyone with knowledge of his filing system. Mrs. Finch, with her nursing background and volunteer access to the practice, would have been perfectly positioned to discover this information. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align with disturbing clarity. A mother seeking revenge for her daughter's death, armed with medical knowledge and access to confidential information, could have planned this murder with the precision of a surgical procedure. Miss Marple returned to the village hall, where Inspector Slack was supervising the collection of physical evidence from the baking displays. She found the inspector examining Mrs. Finch's haunted house with particular attention, carefully documenting each component of the elaborate gingerbread structure. The black icing that created such a dramatic effect would have contained the carmine that triggered Vanessa's fatal reaction. Chapter 5. Tracing the specialized food coloring purchase. Inspector Slack's investigation into the sugar flare spectral black food coloring proved illuminating in ways that extended beyond its chemical composition. The brand was not commonly available in local shops, which raised the question of where Mrs. Finch had obtained it. When questioned directly, the retired nurse claimed to have purchased it at a specialty baking supply store in Much Benham, though she could not produce a receipt. Miss Marple suggested that the inspector might contact suppliers in the surrounding area to determine whether this particular product was readily available or required special ordering. The results of this inquiry were revealing. None of the shops in much Benham, St Mary Mead, or the neighbouring villages carried Sugar Flare Spectral Black as a regular stock item. It could be ordered, but required advance notice, and typically took several days to arrive from the distributor. The nearest shop that did stock the product regularly was located in a town called Westbury, approximately 30 miles from St Mary Mead. Inspector Slack made the journey to interview the proprietor, a chatty woman named Mrs. Henderson, who kept meticulous records of her specialty sales. She recalled Mrs. Finch's visit quite clearly, as the retired nurse had been very specific about wanting that particular brand and had asked several detailed questions about its ingredients. The purchase had occurred 6 weeks earlier, considerably in advance of the Halloween bake-off. Mrs. Henderson remembered commenting on the early preparation, to which Mrs. Finch had responded that she wanted to ensure she had exactly the right supplies for a very special project. The timing suggested extensive planning, rather than a spontaneous decision to enter the competition. Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. Mrs. Finch had not simply happened to use a food colouring that contained carmine. She had deliberately sought out a product containing this specific ingredient, travelling a considerable distance to obtain it. This level of premeditation indicated that the retired nurse had been planning Vanessa's murder for weeks, perhaps even months. The investigation into Mrs. Finch's background revealed additional troubling patterns. Her daughter Catherine's suicide 2 years earlier had been preceded by a period of severe depression directly attributable to Vanessa's televised review. The young chef had been featured on Vanessa's programme Culinary Critiques, where aspiring cooks competed for mentorship opportunities. Catherine's performance had been technically excellent, but Vanessa had chosen to focus her commentary on the young woman's appearance and personality, rather than her cooking skills. The review had been vicious even by Vanessa's standards. She had described Catherine as mousy and unappealing, suggesting that no restaurant would want such an uninspiring person representing their kitchen regardless of cooking ability. The comments had gone viral on social media, subjecting Catherine to widespread mockery and destroying her prospects in the competitive culinary world. Within months, the promising young chef had withdrawn from professional cooking entirely. Mrs. Finch had documented Catherine's decline meticulously, keeping news clippings and printouts of social media posts. After her daughter's death, she had begun collecting information about Vanessa's career, noting other instances where the food critics' reviews had damaged or destroyed culinary careers. Miss Marple discovered this documentation when Inspector Slack obtained a warrant to search Mrs. Finch's cottage. The materials were stored in a neat folder labelled simply Catherine, tucked away in a desk drawer in Mrs. Finch's study. The folder contained not only information about her daughter's tragedy, but also detailed research about carmine allergies, shellfish sensitivity, and cross-reactions between insect-derived proteins and shellfish proteins. There were printouts from medical journals describing anaphylaxis symptoms and treatment, along with information about how EpiPens functioned. Most damning was a timeline that Mrs. Finch had created, noting Vanessa's public appearances and judging commitments for the past year. The Halloween bake-off in St Mary Mead had been circled in red, with a note indicating that Vanessa had confirmed her participation as celebrity judge 3 months earlier. This was shortly after Vanessa's initial shellfish allergy diagnosis, suggesting that Mrs. Finch had been monitoring the food critic's schedule, specifically waiting for an opportunity. Inspector Slack also discovered that Mrs. Finch had attended several baking classes over the summer, ostensibly to improve her skills for the competition. However, her focus had been almost exclusively on gingerbread construction and royal icing techniques, the specific skills needed to create her elaborate haunted house. The instructor remembered her as an unusually dedicated student who practiced the same designs repeatedly until achieving perfection. The evidence suggested a portrait of a woman who had spent months preparing for this single act of revenge. Every aspect of the murder had been carefully planned, from selecting the perfect vehicle for the carmine allergen to ensuring she would be the final contestant Vanessa tasted. Mrs. Finch had even volunteered to organise the judging order, claiming it would help ensure an efficient process, when in reality it allowed her to position her entry last in the sequence. Chapter 6. The sabotaged EpiPen tells its story. The laboratory analysis of Vanessa's EpiPen confirmed Dr. Haydock's initial suspicions. The device had indeed been emptied of its original epinephrine medication and refilled with sterile saline solution. The tampering had been done with considerable skill, suggesting someone familiar with medical equipment and procedures. The rubber stopper showed minute puncture marks, consistent with repeated needle insertions, indicating the medication had been extracted and replaced through multiple careful injections. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Slack when he questioned Mrs. Finch about her nursing background, particularly her experience with emergency medications. The retired nurse explained that she had worked in both general practice and hospital emergency departments during her 40-year career, giving her extensive familiarity with EpiPens and other emergency injection devices. She demonstrated considerable knowledge about how the devices functioned and how they were properly administered. When asked directly whether she had ever handled Vanessa's personal EpiPen, Mrs. Finch maintained her composure admirably. She stated that she had no opportunity to access the food critic's handbag, as she had been focused on her baking throughout the evening. However, Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Finch moving about the hall during the early part of the competition, ostensibly checking on other contestants' progress but frequently passing near the chair where Vanessa's handbag had been carelessly abandoned. The timing of the sabotage proved crucial to understanding the murder's planning. The EpiPen had to be tampered with after Vanessa arrived at the village hall, but before her allergic reaction occurred. This narrow window meant the killer needed to act during the competition itself, requiring both opportunity and considerable nerve. Mrs. Finch's witch costume, with its voluminous sleeves and multiple pockets, would have provided ample concealment for the tools needed to accomplish this task. Inspector Slack ordered a thorough search of Mrs. Finch's costume, which had been carefully preserved as potential evidence. In one of the deep pockets sewn into the witch's robe, investigators discovered several items that proved difficult to explain. A small syringe with a fine needle, ostensibly for precise icing work, but equally suitable for extracting and injecting liquids. An empty EpiPen cartridge that matched the brand Vanessa had carried, and most damning, a small vial of clear liquid that laboratory analysis confirmed was sterile saline solution. When confronted with these discoveries, Mrs. Finch's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She insisted the items were innocent, that the syringe was indeed for decorating work, and the empty cartridge had been found discarded in the village hall's waste bin. However, her explanation for possessing sterile saline solution was less convincing. She claimed to use it for cleaning her contact lenses, though subsequent investigation revealed she had undergone laser eye surgery 3 years earlier and no longer required corrective lenses of any kind. Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Finch's hands trembled slightly as she handled the evidence bags, a nervous gesture at odds with her usual steady demeanour. The retired nurse, who had once dealt calmly with medical emergencies, now found herself facing accusations of causing a medical emergency deliberately. The irony seemed not lost on Mrs. Finch herself, whose expression conveyed a complex mixture of defiance and resignation. Dr. Haydock provided additional testimony regarding Mrs. Finch's access to his medical practice. He confirmed that she had volunteered regularly even after retirement, often arriving early in the morning to help with filing before the day's appointments began. This early arrival would have given her unsupervised time with patient records, including the consultation notes regarding Vanessa's shellfish allergy. The physician expressed genuine distress at this revelation, feeling personally responsible for the breach of patient confidentiality. He explained that he had trusted Mrs. Finch implicitly, never imagining that her volunteer work might be motivated by anything other than a desire to remain connected to the medical profession she had served so long. The betrayal of that trust added another dimension to the tragedy. Inspector Slack's questioning revealed that Mrs. Finch had specifically requested to volunteer on the days when filing needed to be done, claiming she found the organizational work soothing. In reality, this preference had given her regular opportunities to browse through patient files without arousing suspicion. The system Dr. Haydock used for filing was one Mrs. Finch had helped establish during her employment, making her intimately familiar with where to find specific types of information. The evidence was mounting steadily, creating a portrait of calculated revenge executed with the precision one might expect from someone with decades of medical experience. Yet Mrs. Finch continued to maintain her innocence, insisting that coincidence and circumstantial evidence were being woven into a narrative that bore no resemblance to reality. Chapter 7. A mother's diary reveals careful planning. The discovery of Mrs. Finch's diary proved to be the most damning evidence yet uncovered. Inspector Slack found it hidden in a locked drawer of the desk in her study, concealed beneath a collection of Catherine's childhood drawings and school reports. The diary was a substantial leather-bound volume, its pages filled with Mrs. Finch's neat handwriting, documenting her thoughts and plans over the course of nearly a year. The entries began shortly after the first anniversary of Catherine's death, expressing a mother's ongoing grief and anger at the woman she held responsible for her daughter's suicide. The early pages contained emotional outpourings that were painful to read, describing sleepless nights and days spent looking at photographs of happier times. However, as the months progressed, the tone shifted from grief to something more focused and purposeful. Mrs. Finch had begun researching Vanessa's career systematically, noting her television appearances, restaurant reviews, and public commitments. She documented other instances where Vanessa's harsh criticism had damaged careers, collecting testimonials from chefs and restaurateurs who had suffered at the food critic's hands. The research was thorough and methodical, revealing a woman who had transformed her grief into a project with a specific goal. The diary entries from 4 months earlier showed Mrs. Finch's growing interest in food allergies, particularly those that could prove fatal if not properly treated. She had spent considerable time reading medical journals and consulting online resources about anaphylaxis, noting with particular interest the potential for shellfish allergies to cross-react with certain food additives. The entry dated 3 months earlier, shortly after Vanessa's shellfish allergy diagnosis, contained a single underlined sentence that sent chills through Miss Marple when she read it. Finally, a vulnerability. Subsequent entries detailed Mrs. Finch's discovery that carmine food colouring could trigger reactions in people with shellfish allergies. She had researched where to obtain carmine-containing products and had experimented with different black food colourings to determine which would provide the most dramatic effect while delivering the necessary allergen. The attention to detail was extraordinary, revealing a mind that had approached murder as a problem to be solved through careful planning and execution. The entry dated 6 weeks before the Halloween bake-off recorded Mrs. Finch's purchase of the Sugar Flare Spectral Black colouring from the shop in Westbury. She noted with satisfaction that the product contained carmine derived from cochineal insects, along with detailed notes about the concentration needed to achieve the desired colour intensity. She had calculated that the amount of carmine in a single square of gingerbread would be sufficient to trigger a severe reaction in someone with Vanessa's level of shellfish sensitivity. Further entries documented Mrs. Finch's practice sessions creating gingerbread structures, noting improvements in her piping technique and construction methods. She had devoted hours to perfecting her haunted house design, ensuring it would be impressive enough to warrant being saved for the final tasting. The diary revealed that she had even consulted with Mrs. Bantry about the judging order, suggesting that the most elaborate entries be saved for last to create dramatic tension. The diary entries from a month before the competition describe Mrs. Finch's visit to Dr. Haydock's practice to volunteer with filing. She wrote matter-of-factly about discovering Vanessa's consultation notes regarding the shellfish allergy and learning that the food critic had been prescribed an EpiPen. The entry continued with observations about how EpiPens functioned and speculation about what might happen if the medication were replaced with an ineffective substitute. The final entry, dated the morning of the Halloween bake-off, was brief but devastating in its implications. Mrs. Finch had written, "Today Eleanor's daughter gets justice. The woman who destroyed her will tastes death in something sweet, poetic really." There was no expression of doubt or remorse, only calm determination that this was the right course of action. Inspector Slack read portions of the diary aloud to Mrs. Finch, who listened with an expression that gradually shifted from denial to resignation. When he finished, she sat in silence for several long moments before speaking. Her voice, when it came, was steady and unapologetic. She explained that Catherine had been everything to her after becoming widowed 15 years earlier. Her daughter's passion for cooking had brought joy to both their lives. When Vanessa's review destroyed Catherine's career and self-worth, Mrs. Finch had watched helplessly as depression consumed the vibrant young woman she loved. Catherine's suicide had left a void that could never be filled, only avenged. Mrs. Finch produced additional documentation from her handbag, materials she had apparently been carrying as a form of validation. These were emails and letters from other chefs whose lives had been damaged by Vanessa's cruelty. Some described lost businesses, others mentioned broken marriages or substance abuse problems triggered by the public humiliation of Vanessa's reviews. The food critic had left a trail of destruction throughout the culinary world. Miss Marple listened to this recitation with a heavy heart, understanding the genuine pain that had motivated such terrible actions. Yet she could not condone murder regardless of the circumstances. When Mrs. Finch finished speaking, Miss Marple asked quietly whether she had considered that Vanessa's death would not restore Catherine's life, or undo the harm that had been done. Mrs. Finch met her gaze directly, acknowledging that revenge had not brought the peace she had imagined. However, she insisted that preventing Vanessa from destroying other young lives had been worth any price she might pay. She spoke of justice rather than revenge, though Miss Marple recognized this as a distinction without meaningful difference. Chapter 8. The Witch Costume Conceals Damning Trophies. Inspector Slack's examination of Mrs. Finch's witch costume revealed even more incriminating evidence than the items initially discovered in the pockets. The elaborate outfit had been constructed specifically for the Halloween bake-off, with multiple hidden compartments sewn into the flowing black fabric. These concealed spaces had been designed to hold various items needed for the murder, while allowing Mrs. Finch to move freely through the village hall without arousing suspicion. In a particularly well-disguised pocket near the hem, investigators found what could only be described as trophies from the crime. Mrs. Finch had kept the original EpiPen cartridge after emptying it of epinephrine, along with the syringe she had used to extract the medication. These items had no practical purpose after the murder was complete, suggesting she had retained them as physical proof of her successful revenge against Vanessa Blackwood. The costume's construction itself demonstrated considerable planning and skill. Mrs. Finch had apparently taught herself basic sewing techniques over the summer, taking classes at a local craft shop to perfect her abilities. The instructor remembered her as an unusually focused student who had been very specific about wanting to create garments with concealed storage spaces, claiming she wanted to make theatrical costumes for a local drama group. Dr. Haydock provided technical analysis of how Mrs. Finch would have executed the EpiPen sabotage. The process required extracting the epinephrine through multiple careful injections to avoid leaving obvious evidence of tampering. The medication had to be replaced with an equal volume of saline solution to maintain the device's weight and appearance. This delicate work would have taken several minutes of concentrated effort. The opportunity had presented itself during the early part of the competition, when Vanessa's handbag sat unattended on a chair near the refreshment table. Mrs. Finch had positioned herself strategically, engaging other contestants in conversation while keeping Vanessa's bag within reach. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing her standing near that area, though no one had observed her actually handling the bag. Miss Marple had been one of those witnesses, though she had not realized the significance of what she was observing at the time. Reflecting on the evening's events, she recalled seeing Mrs. Finch briefly turn her back to the crowd, her hands moving beneath the flowing sleeves of her costume. The gesture had seemed innocuous then, perhaps adjusting her clothing or retrieving a tissue, but now appeared far more sinister. The psychological profile emerging from the investigation painted a picture of a woman driven by grief to commit a carefully planned murder. Mrs. Finch had not acted in a moment of passion, but had spent months preparing every detail. She had acquired specialized knowledge about allergies and emergency medications. She had obtained the specific food coloring needed to trigger Vanessa's reaction. She had created a costume designed to conceal the tools of murder while maintaining an innocent appearance. Yet despite this damning evidence, Mrs. Finch showed no remorse for her actions. When questioned about her feelings toward Vanessa's death, she stated simply that justice had been served. She viewed herself not as a murderer, but as an instrument of righteous retribution, protecting future victims from a woman who had destroyed lives without conscience or consequence. Chapter 9. Confronting the grieving mother turned murderer. The formal confrontation between Mrs. Finch and the authorities took place in Inspector Slack's office, an austere room that seemed to match the gravity of the situation. Miss Marple had been invited to attend, her contributions to solving the case earning her this unusual privilege. She sat quietly in the corner, observing the retired nurse who had transformed grief into murder with such methodical precision. Inspector Slack laid out the evidence systematically, each piece contributing to an overwhelming case. The diary entries documenting months of planning, the specialized food coloring purchased from a distant supplier, the sabotaged EpiPen with its telltale signs of tampering, the costume with its hidden compartments and preserved trophies. Mrs. Finch listened without interruption, her expression revealing neither surprise nor denial. When the inspector finished his recitation, Mrs. Finch spoke with unexpected calm. She acknowledged everything, confirming each detail of the investigation with the precision of someone providing a medical case history. Yes, she had discovered Vanessa's shellfish allergy through unauthorized access to patient files. Yes, she had deliberately selected carmine-containing food coloring, knowing it would trigger a fatal reaction. Yes, she had sabotaged the EpiPen to ensure the allergic response would prove lethal. However, Mrs. Finch insisted on providing context for her actions. She produced years of documentation showing how Vanessa's television review of Catherine had been deliberately exaggerated and malicious. The criticism had focused not on the food quality but on personal attacks designed to humiliate. Mrs. Finch had researched the episode's production and discovered that Vanessa had specifically requested Catherine as a contestant after learning she was a local chef gaining recognition. The food critic had apparently viewed Catherine as competition in the television personality sphere and had used her platform to eliminate a potential rival. Emails obtained through Freedom of Information requests showed Vanessa discussing Catherine with producers, describing her as too pretty and too talented to be allowed success in what Vanessa considered her domain. The review had been personal destruction disguised as professional criticism. Mrs. Finch argued passionately that her daughter's suicide was not the result of mental instability, but a direct consequence of systematic bullying and career destruction. Catherine had been a confident, successful young chef until Vanessa's review made her unemployable and subjected her to ongoing harassment from Vanessa's online followers. The depression that followed was a rational response to having her life's work destroyed by someone with the power to influence public opinion. Miss Marple listened to this defense with considerable sympathy, understanding how a mother's love could be twisted into something dark and terrible. Yet she could not accept Mrs. Finch's justification for murder. When invited to comment, she spoke gently but firmly about the distinction between understanding motivation and excusing actions. Vanessa Blackwood had been cruel and destructive, possibly causing multiple suicides beyond Catherine's. However, responding to murder with murder simply created more victims. Mrs. Finch turned to face Miss Marple directly, her expression showing frustration that someone she respected could not see the righteousness of her cause. She insisted that she had prevented Vanessa from destroying other young lives, that her action was protective rather than vengeful. How many more Catherines would have suffered if Vanessa had been allowed to continue her reign of terror in the culinary world? Chapter 10. Justice weighs grief against premeditated murder. The legal proceedings that followed Mrs. Finch's arrest generated considerable debate throughout St. Mary Mead and beyond. The case presented moral complexities that divided public opinion sharply. Many sympathized with a mother's grief and agreed that Vanessa Blackwood had been a destructive force who bore responsibility for multiple ruined careers. Others insisted that premeditated murder could never be justified, regardless of the victim's character or the killer's motivation. Miss Marple found herself troubled by aspects of the case that extended beyond the immediate crime. Mrs. Finch's unauthorized access to patient files represented a profound betrayal of medical confidentiality that had implications for everyone who trusted their personal health information to physicians. The retired nurse had not simply discovered Vanessa's shellfish allergy accidentally, but had deliberately searched through records specifically seeking information she could weaponize. Dr. Haydock was devastated by this breach of trust within his practice. He implemented new security protocols and electronic record-keeping systems to prevent future unauthorized access. However, he acknowledged that no system could completely eliminate risk when trusted individuals chose to abuse their positions. The incident prompted discussions throughout the medical community about balancing accessibility for legitimate staff needs against protecting patient privacy. The question of Vanessa Blackwood's own culpability generated heated discussion. Investigation into her career revealed a pattern of deliberately cruel reviews that went far beyond honest criticism. Multiple chefs came forward with stories of careers destroyed by reviews that focused on personal attacks rather than food quality. Some described developing anxiety disorders or abandoning the profession entirely after being publicly humiliated by Vanessa's commentary. However, Miss Marple emphasized that Vanessa's cruelty, while reprehensible, did not constitute a capital offense justifying execution. The appropriate response to destructive criticism was exposure and accountability through legal and professional channels, not murder. Society's legal framework existed precisely to prevent individuals from taking justice into their own hands based on personal grievances. The trial itself became a media sensation, with journalists analysing whether Mrs. Finch's actions constituted premeditated murder or a form of justified defence of others. Her legal team argued for diminished capacity due to prolonged grief and trauma from her daughter's suicide. They presented psychiatric testimony describing how bereavement could impair judgment and create obsessive thought patterns that seemed rational to the grieving individual. The prosecution, however, emphasized the extensive planning evidence by Mrs. Finch's diary and the calculated nature of her actions. This was not a crime of passion or temporary insanity, but a methodically executed murder requiring months of preparation. The sabotage of emergency medication demonstrated particularly cold-blooded intent, as it ensured Vanessa would suffer the terror of anaphylaxis while unable to save herself. Miss Marple attended the trial as both witness and observer, providing testimony about her observations during the Halloween bake-off. She described Mrs. Finch's demeanour throughout the evening, noting the controlled precision that characterized her every action. When questioned about her personal opinion, Miss Marple stated simply that she had encountered evil disguised as justice before and recognized it here despite the sympathetic circumstances. The jury's verdict reflected the case's moral complexity. Mrs. Finch was found guilty of premeditated murder, the evidence too overwhelming to permit any other conclusion. However, the judge's sentencing took into account her previously exemplary character, her genuine grief, and the provocative nature of Vanessa's treatment of Catherine. The sentence was severe but included provisions for psychiatric treatment and eventual possibility of parole. As Miss Marple reflected on the case in the weeks that followed, she found herself thinking about the various victims this tragedy had created. Catherine Finch, whose promising life had been destroyed by cruel criticism. Vanessa Blackwood, whose own cruelty had ultimately led to her death. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, whose love for her daughter had been corrupted into murderous obsession, and the broader community, left to grapple with questions about revenge, justice, and the price of grief. The Halloween bake-off would not be held again. The village hall's association with murder had tainted what had been intended as innocent celebration. Miss Marple thought this perhaps fitting, a reminder that evil could corrupt even the most cheerful traditions when human nature's darker impulses were allowed to flourish unchecked.